Well, welcome ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to members and guests of the May meeting of the Royal Society of Tasmania, Northern Branch. To those of us who are actually here present in body and those who are in the cloud. Next month's meeting will mark the occasion of our 100th year. We hope to have with us also our new governor, but that's not yet confirmed. Miss Barbara Baker will be ex officio the patron of the Society and in direct succession to Queen Victoria. We hold in historic memory the Marina people on whose land we meet as beneficiaries of their dispossession, and we acknowledge the Palawa people in our community and their elders past, present and to come. I was born into a world where there were two kinds of plastic, although the term was not in common use. There was celluloid, a brittle material used to make Kewpie dolls, and bakelite, a mysterious substance used for light switches and power points that also appeared in the form of a toy I was given. I grew up in the world where we could still find in the evening star at night without having to hunt for it amongst all the space rubbish that there is now. It was a world where we could still wander in a wilderness without a road through it. Many of us wrestle with the ethical dilemmas of unavoidable plastic consumables, and we send for hopeful recycling whatever we can, and consign to landfill and the archaeologists of the future what we cannot. Troubled with the sight of obvious plastic litter, we worry about the polystyrene beads that wash up on every shore in the world, and the microscopic particles that we know to be invisibly entering the environment in a steady stream. Today we're to learn about the real impact of some of this. Dr. Jennifer Lavers tells me that she originated in Canada, but she's thoroughly adopted Tasmania in every sense of the word. She's lived in the proper end of the island up here, but she's now exiled in Hobart. She lectures in marine science at the University of Tasmania Institute of Marine and Antarctic Studies. She conducts research on the health of the oceans as reflected on remote islands and by birds of the oceans. And she teaches, supervises and coordinates the mentoring of researchers by other scientists through a body appropriately called Adrift Lab. I have much pleasure in cutting her adrift to speak to us on the impact of plastics on marine life.
Thank you for an incredible introduction. Wonderful. Thank you ever so much for having me. Can everyone in the back hear me okay? Amazing. Good. Wonderful. Now, I'm usually a really animated speaker, and I'm going to fight the urge to migrate over that way and also away from the microphone. So hopefully I'm not too scattered and doing a dance like this all for the next 40 minutes. Okay, I don't have to really introduce myself because I've just had that fabulous introduction. Let's get started. So normally I begin my lectures with a bunch of statistics, facts and figures about the amount of plastic that's entering in our oceans, where it comes from, types, colours, all kinds of things. But I'm actually going to skip all of that. And instead I'm showing you this image of, you have to kind of use your imagination. I'm going to call this the Milky Way. It's not, but let's just all imagine that together. The sky at night over Mount Wellington. Now, why am I showing you this? Well, the Milky Way has approximately 100 billion stars. At present, scientists estimate that there is somewhere in the range of about 5.25 trillion pieces of plastic floating in just the top 10 centimeters of the world's oceans. So that means already there is approximately 50 times more plastic in the ocean's surface than there are stars in the Milky Way. So why did I skip all the useful facts and figures about plastic and instead show you a photo of the Milky Way? Well, the reason is that plastic is now recognized as one of the emerging, rapidly so, environmental risks to our planet, on par with things like climate change. And the challenge with vast quantities of plastic accumulating all over the place, really, really high densities, billions over here, trillions over there, up on Mount Everest, down at the bottom of the Marianas Trench, everywhere we look, is that these numbers are so vast that as individuals, we hear them so often and they're so big. We struggle to grapple with what they really mean. And as scientists, this is big data. We struggle with how to best communicate this to the broadest possible audience, to make it relatable. So instead of throwing a bunch of facts and figures at you that you'll probably all forget, because I forget them half the time, it's more useful to provide you with an analogy, something that we can all connect with, a view of the stars. So now that you have a bit of an idea of just how much plastic is out there, what is this talk actually going to focus on? So I'm not going to throw any more big facts and figures about where plastic comes from and how much we recycle or don't or anything like that. What I'm actually going to focus the entire talk on is what is it actually doing to our natural world? What do we need to be mindful of? Much of what we already know, and probably what you've seen in the news, is the stuff that is really obvious, the really graphic images. So you probably can think in your mind right now of the iconic photos of the albatross with the toothbrushes and the cigarette lighters and the bottle caps, or the sperm whale that's washed up on a beach with 143 different kinds of fishing line, or something like that. These are the examples of where plastic has had an impact on our natural world in a really obvious and graphic way. But in reality, these types of events often are quite rare. They impact a few individuals here and there, but it's often not widespread. What is widespread is something we call sublethal impacts. These are the impacts that are very difficult, if not impossible, to see with the naked eye. This is important. As a scientist and a science communicator, how do I communicate to you and to everyone else impacts that you can't even see? So, another analogy. Think about yourselves, your grandchildren, literally anyone you know who might have, diabetes, kidney disease, liver disease, cancer. Can you see it on the outside? Could you walk up to me and know what chronic conditions I have? No. You can't see it with the naked eye. But I guarantee you almost all of us has something or knows someone who has at least one condition. It will cause them suffering. It will shorten their lifespan. This is what we're talking about with sublethal impacts. But with wildlife, that animal can't walk up to me and say, "Hey, scientist, I hurt here. I'm suffering. Help me." And that is my job, to tease that apart, to figure that out, to look at that animal that is still alive, it is still walking around, it is still breathing. I can do a census and I can count it, and I might even be able to count it next year and conclude that that population is not yet in decline. But I need to quantify that suffering when you can't see it with the naked eye. This is the scale of the challenge that we currently face, and this is huge. So, what is all this plastic doing to the natural world? I want to introduce you to my little friend. Right in the middle, if you can see it, a tiny little crab, hermit crab in a shell. All around the world, billions of these gorgeous little creatures are going about their day-to-day business. They are living in a tiny little confined space between the forest, the beach, and the shallow waters of the ocean. This is the confines of their world. This is all they've ever known. It is a beautiful and otherwise pristine place, until recently. This area of the forest, the beach, and the ocean is now, for the most part, utterly inundated with our waste. So imagine being a tiny little 1 centimeter crab and having to run the gauntlet of the world's waste, essentially climb the equivalent of Mount Everest as you try to navigate between that forest, across that beach, and to that ocean to rehydrate, to deposit your eggs. You now have to go up and over a massive mountain of debris that has accumulated on many of the world's beaches. It's coming. We'll try it again. I hope it doesn't skip forward. This is what ultimately eventuates. You are a tiny little crab. You have sticks for legs. You have no claws or other structures that can help you dig out from underneath something or otherwise escape. Escape is not part of how you evolved. It's not something you're familiar with. And so amongst the mountain of waste that has accumulated on our beach, as you go up and over Mount Everest every day as you go about your daily lives, you fall into things. Various bottles, containers, contraptions, broken buoys that have cracks and holes in them. And when you fall in, you cannot get out. You did not evolve escape mechanisms. You have little stumps for legs. What you did evolve, though, incredibly, is a remarkable sense of smell. Now, why do hermit crabs have an incredible sense of smell? It's because the limiting commodity in hermit crab life is the shell. And if you die, there is a huge line of hermit crabs behind you who are desperate to take over your shell. A shell is a hot, hot commodity in hermit crab life. And so hermit crabs have evolved to be able to smell, bear with me, it's a little bit morbid, the scent of a decaying friend, one of the other hermit crabs. So as soon as one hermit crab falls inside of a plastic container, they die and they release the scent that says, "Hey, friends, come find my shell." And now all the other hermit crabs, all their friends and partners, emerge and come to the same area, and they all fall in to these containers. The one in the bottom right-hand corner, one container, 526 individual hermit crabs. Now, from 2 islands in the world, we conducted this study last year, well, before last year, before we went into lockdown, and we estimate that approximately 1 million hermit crabs die on tropical sandy beaches all around the world in this manner. That is just 2 islands, 1 million hermit crabs. So I want you to think about all the places you've ever been in the world where there were hermit crabs scurrying around your feet, and think about whether or not you also noticed plastic debris on those beaches. That is the world that they now live in. And if you're thinking, what can I do? Every single bottle you can pick up and keep out of the ocean matters. So let's take a moment to look at the actual plastics themselves. If we're not talking about big pieces of plastic, intact bottles and containers, let's look at the small pieces, about the actual fragments. So plastic is often referred to as a vector, a transport mechanism for a whole suite of chemicals. How and why does this come about? So as plastic is manufactured, something should pop up. Oh, there we go. Pop up on the screen. So as plastic is manufactured in its original form, we kind of manufacture into it or compound into the product a whole range of chemicals. And this is because we want the plastic to be flexible. We want it to be fire resistant. We want it to have a particular color or whatever it is that we might want the plastic to do. We want it to have certain properties. But that requires chemicals, and those chemicals are not necessarily harmless. In fact, most of the time, they're not. In addition, as the plastic floats around in our oceans for years, decades, it kind of degrades partially and breaks down. And what happens is what's shown in the image along the bottom. It goes from a new, resin pellet, plastic resin pellet, very smooth, perfect surface, to a very bumpy, lumpy, textured surface, which indicates it's been around for a while. It's kind of been bashed in the UV and the wind and the waves and maybe on some rocks. And what it does as it gets old and degraded is it becomes much more porous, textured. It allows things to suck onto the surface. The plastic basically becomes like a magnet or a sponge. And all these chemicals that we've released through things like burning of fossil fuels up into the atmosphere, precipitates down into the ocean, now sucks onto the surface of the plastic, and it becomes almost like what I call little toxic bullets. So bear with me for a second, these look a little bit complicated. They're actually quite cool. So I got to go to something called the Australian Synchrotron Institute in Melbourne a couple of years ago. I sit in a tiny little lead box with a bunch of physicists. Forgive me, physicists, if you're in the audience. They blew my mind. I didn't understand anything they were saying. And sit in a little lead box and shoot laser beams at plastic. And what those laser beams did was show us a couple of things. The first panel here on the left is actually a slice, a thin slice through a bottle cap. You can see the little ripples. That's the inner ridge from where you would screw the bottle cap onto the top of the bottle cap. And what I'm trying to show you here is that discoloration. Can I use the laser pointer? Is Jen skilled enough to do that? Maybe. Oh yeah, there. So you see the little dark patches there? That is discoloration that has occurred through the accumulation of chemicals. And basically what it's showing us is that there are very few chemicals that have accumulated in the center of that plastic because they don't penetrate into the middle of the plastic. All of the chemicals are on the outer surface. And this is what the laser is showing us. So the bromine, the zinc, the iron, and all the other elements are accumulated on the outer surface. So this is reinforcing what I've just said. That as the plastic is floating around in the ocean, it's sucking things onto the surface and it's concentrating it a lot. It's becoming toxic, much more toxic than it was when it was brand new. Why does this matter? Oh, good, that popped up. When animals consume that plastic, here I've shown you a seabird, but imagine it's a tuna fish, it's a shark, it's a whale, it's a dolphin, it's a sea turtle, whatever it might be. When they consume these pieces of plastic, the million-dollar question now is that chemical on the surface of the plastic liberated by all the digestive enzymes out into the animal's bloodstream? That's a hint of what's to come. I'm going to loop back to that in a second. Come on. I don't want to hit it twice and then it's going to skip way forward. There we go. Okay, so let's dig into what we've been doing for a really long time. So one of our long-term study sites is on Lord Howe Island, 600 kilometers off the coast of Australia. I hope most of you have gotten to go there. If not, go, it's amazing. And we go there because there's a number of seabird species, the flesh-footed shearwater in the middle and the wedge-tailed shearwater on the bottom. And we're really interested in seabirds because as scientists all around the world, we regard them as sentinel species or bioindicators. They're at the top of the marine food web, and so we can make some fairly safe assumptions that if our top predators are doing well, if they're surviving, they're breeding, their populations are increasing, then all of the little teeny tiny things below them, the fish and the squid and stuff like that, are probably also doing well. Because as scientists, we don't have time and money to monitor everything. The oceans are too complex. What we can see from the red list, which is a list of threatened species all around the world, run by the IUCN, is that birds in general, this is for all birds, which is shown in the gold, are not doing especially well, but seabirds along the bottom are declining faster than any other bird group. So that signals to us that the oceans are perhaps telling us something. There's a bit of a warning sign there. There we go. So this is the actual data that we've got over the last kind of 15 or 20 years on Lord Howe Island, just a subset. And what we can see from the flesh-footed shearwater in red and the wedge-tailed shearwater in blue is that there was an initial fairly rapid increase in the amount of plastic that the birds contained. And that since about 2010, 2011, 2012, things have gotten a little bit wobbly, shall we say. quite variable and very, very difficult for me and my team to predict. One year we go there and the birds are just full of plastic, and the next year we go and they're not. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about why that is, but what I will say is that as scientists, it means that it's really difficult to predict and to understand what's going on. And it really suggests that we've shifted into a new phase. For a while, things were really consistently heading into one direction, and now things have gotten all kind of erratic and all over the place. And so we have to start asking the question, like, what does that actually mean? I don't have an answer yet, but it is kind of setting off alarm bells in my mind about like the need to ask this question and point it out to you. Okay, so we come back to this million-dollar question that I started off with, which is, what is all this plastic doing to our marine wildlife? So I'm going to spend the next couple of slides going through some of our more recent research on these sublethal effects that I alluded to. And I'm going to start with the kind of the more basic one, a really good starting point, and the first one that we looked into in 2014. So in 2014, we asked the question, if an animal ingests plastic, what can we detect? What can we see? What changes? And what we looked at is whether or not ingested plastic changes body condition or body size. And what we found is the answer to that is a resounding yes. So you can see on the plot here, we've got body mass as an indication of kind of body condition on the left-hand y-axis, and we've got number of ingested plastics as an indication of exposure on the x-axis. And the more plastic you have, the lower your body mass is. Fairly consistent. We've got way more data than this now. This is data from 2011. We've now got data all the way up to this year. I just came back from Lord Howe Island last week, and this trend has continued over the last decade. So this is holding very consistent over time. So this shows us that as you consume plastic, and this makes a lot of sense, you have lower body size. So you have less body fat. You've been fed a lot of plastic and probably not a lot of fish and squid and other good things that you should have been fed. And so your body mass, you didn't grow the way you should. What we also found in this same study, but I haven't included the plots for, is that if you have lots of plastic, you also have a number of other changes. So things like you have shorter wings, you have shorter various head measurements as well. Why does this matter? These are very young birds. So the photo that you see in the top right-hand corner is a bird that is only 80 or 90 days old. All of that plastic in both of those images in only 80 or 90 days. The record holder had 276 pieces, accounting for 15% of the bird's body mass. Take your body mass right now and multiply it by 15% in your head. Now imagine going about your day-to-day business, picking up your car, doing your grocery shopping, anything, with that much plastic in your stomach. We are essentially asking these animals to go about their daily business with that plastic in their stomachs, and in this case, with reduced body mass, reduced wing length, and very small, pretty much everything else, heads, the whole works. Okay, so this is where I said I was going to loop back to. Let's talk about plastics as a vector for chemicals. Now, I don't want you to get too bogged down in these actual numbers here for a second. What we did, again, shooting laser beams. It's so much fun shooting laser beams at things. This time at feathers. The physicists were just like, you want to shoot laser beams at what? You're a crazy lady. What I want is the take-home message at this first bit of text is that these were all elevated concentrations of heavy metals that we found in the birds. Some of them were extremely highly elevated, and together these elevated heavy metals are associated with things like neurological impairment and various forms of cancers. And so we found these fairly consistently through quite a number of the birds that we tested, indicating that we have a bit of a problem. Importantly, the concentrations of those heavy metals that were elevated was associated with the consumption of that plastic. So what that tells us is that the more plastic you have in your stomach, the higher the concentration of heavy metals you have in your tissues. So it was really pointing us in the direction that that plastic is acting as a vector. It's introducing those chemicals into the animal's tissues. In this case, feathers, but other studies have shown that it introduces it into their liver and into their bloodstream and other things. So plastic can act as a vector to essentially pollute our wildlife. You can do it. Okay, so wrapping up the sublethal effects, I promise this is the last one. I wanted to investigate blood chemistry. Now, why did I want to do this? Well, apart from the changes in body morphology, so reduced wing length and reduced body mass, which if you're lucky as a scientist, I can actually walk up to a bird and say, oh, that bird looks like it's quite small and its wing length, it's shortened. I could actually see that with the naked eye. The other sublethal effects that I have observed and that I've shown you, like exposure to chemicals, are invisible. We can't see them with the naked eye. And so I started to think about this once again from a human perspective. If you were feeling unwell, but you didn't know what it was that was causing you to feel unwell, you would go to see your GP. And you would say, hi GP, I feel sick, but I don't know what exactly it is. And your GP would say, okay, as a starting point to figure out what's wrong with you, let's run a panel of blood tests. And he would do all kinds of things like your iron levels and all kinds of stuff. Now, the birds, again, can't communicate that to me, but that doesn't mean that I can't treat them in the same way that a GP would. And so I said, right, let's throw the gauntlet of tests at them, because I don't know where they hurt. I don't know what's wrong. But they have a lot of plastic in them, and the odds are something is wrong somewhere. So I worked with an avian pathology lab in Sydney and ran something called a comprehensive avian test. And we tested a whole heap of blood parameters to basically say what could possibly be wrong with these birds. And what did we find? The computer doesn't want to show you. Basically, we found that plastic was directly associated with a number of things. I'm just showing you a few. Elevated concentrations of uric acid and amylase. Why do these matter? Well, because they're associated with kidney disease. And when you have elevated concentrations, it often means that your kidneys are not functioning correctly. So lots of plastic equals high uric acid and high amylase means you probably have something wrong with your kidneys. And you can see that in the plot on the right-hand side. As the plastic goes up, so is your uric acid. The last one was really interesting. Cholesterol is essentially an all or nothing response, and we can see that in the plot at the very bottom. If you have no plastic at all, an absolute zero, then your cholesterol levels are quite low and within normal range. But as soon as you have even one piece of plastic, and that has been one of the questions scientists have been asking for years, is how many pieces of plastic is too much? Is it 1? Is it 5? Is it 10? Do I need to care about one little microplastic in an animal, or do I have to focus on those really graphic images of toothbrushes and bottle caps and things? Is one piece of plastic enough? That plot suggests one piece of plastic is enough. That's what we need to be worried about. Okay. So what have we learned from just even the last 5 years of our long-term study? Sublethal effects of plastic are diverse and super complicated. Most, although not all, are invisible to the naked eye, and so therefore very difficult for me to quantify and to explain to the broader audience. These are likely long-lasting. Things like diabetes and kidney disease probably last the lifetime of that animal. But because most studies are not long-term, they're 1 or 2 years, we have no data. I'm working on that, but right now we have no data. Now, these sublethal effects likely affect most populations and large numbers of those populations. But this is hugely contentious in the scientific literature. Not going to take a deep dive into that one right now, but source of much debate in the plastics community. Now, as we wrap up, before I leave this stage, I want to talk to you about something that matters a lot to me and my team. And it's something that publicly in a forum like this, today is the first day that I'm talking about it. And you might notice that my voice is going to start to shake, and I'm not going to apologize for it. I'm really lucky to work with an incredible group of scientists and students and photographers and artists who work exceptionally hard and volunteer their time to make all of this possible. And the photographers that I work with and the artists that I work with make this work not only possible, but they make it beautiful. And I don't take for granted for 1 second that we work in an incredible, stunning location. I mean, look at us last week. And my beautiful student on the right-hand side of this image is sitting here in the audience tonight. And we know how lucky we are and how privileged I am to be standing here today telling you this story. I mean, look at these people and look at this place. These are beautiful people working exceptionally hard in a spectacular location. And these are the kinds of photos that until last week, they were pretty much the only ones that we shared on social media, and that was the only story that we really told to the broader audience. And we can't do that anymore, and we made a concerted effort as a team that is no longer the only message that we're going to tell. What we're going to start talking about is something that's been recently coined, which is called eco-grief. It is the post-traumatic stress disorder of the environmental era. It is what we are struggling with. It is what is just absolutely breaking us. I don't have words. I didn't prepare anything to say. But it's not being talked about enough. This year was, in all honesty, the worst year in 14, 15 years on Lord Howe Island. It was almost unbearable, and almost every single person on our team sobbed. As the team leader, it is remarkably painful to have to put myself through that and keep myself going, but to also have to pick up every single member of my team. My role in science is to inspire the next generation and to train them to take over in my footsteps. How do I crush them like this? They arrive bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and within weeks they are broken. I don't know how to process that. This is one day's worth of birds. That morning, I forced my 2 photographers to wake up before dawn at 5 a.m., and I insisted that they come with me to bear witness to this, to take these birds and to lay them out on the beach. And they kept asking me, why? Why would I want to do this? How could they possibly, as photographers, make something so horrible look beautiful? And I don't have an answer, and I didn't have an answer then, and I still don't have an answer now. But we had to do it. I just had to. And all I can say as I walk away right now is the moment after we finished taking this photo, we dug an enormous hole in the beach, buried them, and went and boiled a cup of tea. This is not okay. And if right now you're asking, how can I help? Because that is always the question that I get, and that is so hard for me to answer. On Tuesday morning, our lab has new groundbreaking science coming out. Not birds, but still plastic, of course, because that's all we do. And one of the challenges we currently face is that our global community has a lot of big challenges going on right now. COVID, a huge battle in Gaza. And a lot of these environmental crises are not getting the attention that they need in the press. And I truly believe that our society has the capacity to deal with more than one challenge at a time. And so what we need is positive, coordinated action to elevate the profile of environmental crises onto the same platform as some of these other things. And so I ask of you what you can do to help. Is the research that's going to come out on Tuesday morning. One of the journalists who's writing one of the stories for the Launceston Examiner was here. He may have stepped out, Brindley. There will be a story in the Launceston Examiner. The ABC is definitely doing something. Is share that across your networks. This is Tasmanian science from humble little Tasmania. It is world first. This needs to be heard alongside, it's not a competition, alongside everything else. That's it.
Thank you. I'm sure there'll be questions, but what a combination of good science and good passion. Dr. Lavers, I realise that perfectly good new plastics adsorb all sorts of things. I was involved in a court case once which turned on a blood level of a certain drug. It had been put in a polyethylene container, and the polythene had adsorbed a lot of it, and the results were faulty. But so-called degradable plastics designed to be degradable, are they more dangerous in this respect?
That is a fabulous question, and one that I often get asked. So biodegradable and compostable plastics pose a number of challenges. They have potential and capacity to really change the way that we do things if they were done correctly. And that's not to say that some on the market aren't being created, manufactured correctly. But unfortunately, the bulk, the majority of compostable and biodegradable plastics are not actually performing to the standards that we would desire in our society. So an example, and that's just one example, is a study that we published last year looking at balloons, of all things, that are labeled as biodegradable, and balloons that were just traditional balloons in normal packaging. And we exposed them to a range of environmentally relevant conditions, so things like freshwater, seawater, extreme temperatures, including a commercial industrial composter. This was a project we did in collaboration with Hobart City Council. Because Hobart is really leading the way in compostables and waste management and really trying to do things in an innovative space here in Australia. And what we found is that over a period of 16 weeks, almost no matter what we threw at these compostable balloons, we basically couldn't actually get them, sorry, not compostable balloons, biodegradable balloons, we couldn't actually get them to biodegrade. So over 16 weeks, there was virtually no evidence of biodegradation, despite the fact that we put them in 60 degrees Celsius and put them in a commercial composter and all of those kinds of things. So at this point, a lot of these products are just not living up to performance and expectation, and it's kind of concerning because a lot of the policy that's being put forward is being encouraging of these types of products, wanting more biodegradables and compostables. And while I absolutely commend that, of course we would all want that, what's happening is that the infrastructure and essentially the timeline that's being put on that. So even the announcement with Coles and Woolies, many of you may have seen it last week, basically said they want Coles, Woolworths, Nestle, and some of the other big players to move to compostables and biodegradables within the next, I believe it was something like 2 to 3 years. That was fantastic. It sounded, in theory, absolutely fantastic. The problem is that to get these products developed, tested, and confirmed that they're going to live up to our expectations, and then to get the waste management infrastructure in place. So this is essentially creating an entirely new waste stream. You need to have a dedicated waste stream to manage biodegradables and compostables. 2 or 3 or even 5 years is not enough. So we need to move forward encouraging these kinds of things, but at the same time, it's a weird thing to say, we almost kind of need to push pause and go, right, we don't need a whole bunch of plastics manufacturers racing to be the first ones to the market to create a biodegradable plastic and a compostable plastic, because we don't know what we're going to get. It won't have been tried and tested rigorously. What we need is policy that says this is what we want, this is a priority, but the product absolutely has to deliver on the following criteria and expectations. And those two things are not happening right now. And we risk ending up with a whole bunch of products that are worse than what we've already got. Yes?
Seems to me there's two problems. One is the stuff that's already out there. Seems to me that there are two problems. One is the stuff that's already out there, and the other is the stuff that we will in future put there. And what you were just talking about certainly addresses the second of those, but there's some sort of reaction that has to be made to stabilise, turn back, degrade in somehow or other the stuff that's out there. So two questions come out of that. One is, so what scientifically is possible? And the second is, what is your feeling about what might be politically possible, given that Hobart's but a speck in the polluted ocean, and, you know, what if China doesn't come on board, or India doesn't come on board, or the people that, you know, Panama or someone that has the flag for most of the container ships going around the world, that sort of thing.
So that's a multifaceted question. I'm going to try and answer as many of the parts as I can. Politically, I don't know that I can comment without digging myself a grave. I guess what I would say is that, amazingly enough, some of the developing countries, like China, are actually racing ahead with innovation and change at a pace that Australia really should endeavour to keep up with. So for example, waste infrastructure in parts of China, they have incredible amounts of sorting that takes place at the individual level. It doesn't put the onus necessarily on the waste collectors, but they have an incredible diversity of bins, and the community is really, really engaged in the waste collection and sorting process. And it just, the process is much more streamlined, and the waste that's collected, a lot more of it can be reused and repurposed. And so I think in some ways we can look to them and how their systems are working. I'm sure in some way you're alluding to things like the Ocean Cleanup Project, which is the huge arrays that are out in the ocean. And I would say that there are some really significant challenges with the Ocean Cleanup Project, which I won't speak to from a personal perspective, but there are some fantastic resources on the web, which I'm happy to make available if people are interested. A number of feasibility reports have been written, and I would actually say that they're not so high tech that they're inaccessible. So I'm happy to make those available to folks if they would like to form their own opinion on the Ocean Cleanup Project. Personally, I think that's a direction we shouldn't really be moving in, at least not at this stage. There's too many very significant hurdles that they still need to address, I think, before the broader scientific community will get on board with that. But that's not to say that there aren't some solutions that have been put forward that are actually getting fairly widespread backing. So, for example, a range of various debris collection booms almost at the point source, so at the mouths of rivers, are looking very, very promising. So some of them are actually using things like bubbles, and they're creating barriers that kind of divert debris to one side of a river or another and allow for large-scale collection to occur much more rapidly and easily with less cost and less kind of bycatch and complication. So that's looking really promising in some settings. Other ones are using things like the Baltimore water wheel. If you haven't ever seen the Baltimore water wheel, that's a really fantastic one, a bit of fun to go and Google and look it up. And similar designs of water wheels have been created and used in other rivers around the world, and those are also looking really promising, and they engage the community in the process as well. The key there is that they work and they don't have all the associated costs and challenges like bycatch that are associated with things like the ocean cleanup. So I guess my answer to that is that like we do still have some meaningful, cost-effective, feasible solutions that aren't maybe getting as much media attention because they're not quite as sexy, but they work. Yes?
Thank you very much, Dr. Lavers. Thanks very much, Dr. Lavers. In relation to the underweight seabirds, was their underweight assessed before or after the plastic was removed?
So it's all at the point of capture when the birds are emerging for the first time from their burrows. So it's once the plastic has accumulated to its maximum volume when the bird is about 90 days of age. Is that enough information to answer your question?
Is the plastic inside them when they're weighed or outside?
It's in them when they're weighed, but we know the weight of the plastic as well. So the plastic is actually collected and weighed independently, so we can easily subtract that from the total body mass.
And is the 15% with or without plastic?
Oh, so that's oh gosh, that's a really good question. That is, I might actually have to go back and look, but so the bird weighed approximately, from memory, about 400 or 450 grams, somewhere in that ballpark, and the plastic was 64 grams. The plastic was definitely 64 grams, and we might have to back calculate what the bird's actual weight was.
So if the plastic's included, that means that birds actually more than 15% underweight.
So the birds are extremely underweight. There's absolutely no doubt of that. So for example, some of the birds, quite a number of the birds that we had this year were in the range of 200 grams. And these birds should, at the time of departure from Lord Howe Island, weigh somewhere in the range of 600 to 750 grams. So to have a bird that weighs 200 grams is so incredibly emaciated, we regularly questioned how the bird was still living and breathing.
Thank you.
Could you comment on the non-macroscopic forms of rubbish, like microbeads that are used in cosmetics, or what happens when the painter washes a water-based paint down the sink?
Yeah, so nanoparticles, very, very small microplastics, is really a rapidly emerging space in the plastics field. Our knowledge of these tiny little particles in a range of media, so either that's like beach sediments, ocean water, or in our wildlife, is quite limited at this point. So for example, in our seabirds, we don't actually have a whole lot of data for virtually any species on the really teeny tiny particles. It's really just a handful of studies. What it's showing is that if you find macro particles, so the big stuff kind of like bottle cap size, maybe the size of your thumbnail, just broadly, and you find microplastics, so a couple of millimeters, then almost certainly you're going to have the teeny tiny particles that you either can barely see with the naked eye or are so small that you definitely cannot see them with the naked eye. And essentially the broader message is that the smaller and smaller items that we look for, we are consistently finding them. It's not like as scientists go down that size category, we just kind of stop finding those pieces. We just keep finding them. And there's one study that always comes to mind when I start thinking about nanoparticles that I think really drives this home, is in your humble cup of tea, if you make a cup of tea with a tea bag that has the tea bag itself is actually plastic, and a lot of them are, and or part of your tea bag might not actually be plastic, but it's adhered, it's sealed with different types of glues and adhesives to keep your tea bag together. That can actually release somewhere in the range of 2 billion nanoparticles of plastic into your humble cup of tea. And so you kind of look at the volume of the ocean or the size of a bird's stomach, or you just, again, we come back to my second slide where we start talking about like huge numbers, big data, where it's just so vast. It gets so difficult to comprehend with, but it all comes back to, you know, the more we know, and the more we can try and prevent from getting into ourselves, into our households, into our oceans, into our wildlife, the quicker, like it really is just as quick as possible, eliminate these things from your life.
Dr. Lavers, is there any acceptable plastic?
Is there any acceptable plastic? I think you're asking the wrong person. Oh gosh, that is such a hard question. I mean, myself personally, I would say no. Because I think, like with all things, we will always find a reason to justify the existence. You know, with fossil fuels, we'll always find a reason that it needs to be burned, maybe not for domestic car use, but for something else. No. But everyone else is absolutely free to disagree with me and view their priorities separate. But what I see and what I have to grapple with day to day, no. Does that mean that I'm perfect at keeping it out of my own life? Do I avoid all plastics? No. It is so hard, and I don't criticize other people for being imperfect. I think that's really key. Don't criticize yourself and don't criticize others. Aim high. You know, tackle the low-hanging fruit, you know, like switch to a bamboo toothbrush and don't use plastic highlighters, make sure you buy the wooden ones, and it's like a million of those kinds of things you can do to lessen your plastic footprint and educate yourself and bring awareness to your home, your workplace, your broader community. Just don't stop, keep challenging yourself. Embrace it like a challenge. It can be a bit of fun. It actually can be fun and rewarding, not overwhelming and despair and depressing. But, you know, like it is absolutely everywhere. We can't escape it yet. And until we can, we can't hold each other to ransom. We just can't.
Every time you go into the supermarket, you find another product put into single-use plastic.
I know.
Like yogurt sachets for babies. Just ridiculous.
I know. It's hard. Yes, so synthetic clothing is a massive source of potentially, one of the more significant sources of micro and nano particles of plastic in the world's oceans, so nylon and other textiles. And so, you know, the best thing you can do is to try and avoid synthetics, you know, buy your cottons and your wools as much as you possibly can. And so people always say to me after I've said that, well, what do I do with stuff that I already own? At which point I get to creep you all out and say that, you know, you can be a bit like me, the strange biologist. You know, I also have synthetic clothing, most of which I've had for years. So for example, I have a polypropylene fleece, which I bought the first year of my PhD back in 2003 when I lived in Canada, and I still have it. And it's kind of like, I'm very conflicted because I obviously hate it because it's synthetic, but I love it because it signifies this like important point in my life when I bought it as a first year PhD, my first field season. And so I just kind of don't really wash it. Very, very infrequently do I wash it. And does it smell like seabird? Yeah, it really does. My dogs love it. So, you know, take that with a grain of salt. But, you know.
Follow-up question then. What would be the least worst substance?
Oh, boy. That is also, you guys are throwing the really tough questions tonight. That is also so hard. So, you know, literally everything we do has some kind of cost associated with it. So that was actually what brought about the wide-scale, one of the things that brought about the wide-scale transition to plastics was, you know, in the 70s, we reflected on our reliance and consumption of paper bags at the grocery store. And we thought, oh, we're cutting down all these trees. This is truly awful. You know, save the trees, use plastic. And that made so much sense at the time, save the trees, use plastic. And of course, we reflect on that now and think, what an awful decision. We certainly could have done better than that. And so, do we go back to paper, or do we try to do cotton? And cotton also has huge challenges associated with it. And one of the things I grappled with was I've recently switched the type of milk that I drink. And so I did this huge investigation into, okay, I can't do dairy anymore, and I also can't do oat milk for various reasons. We don't have to go into that. But do I do almond or macadamia or soy, or what do I do? And I looked into the environmental footprint of all these different milks, and one uses too much water and one uses too much pesticide. And I was just like, went down this rabbit hole of like, oh my gosh, how do I decide? And I think the message just comes back to just do your best, and wherever you can, use less. That's all we can do.
Is there research currently looking at the chemical contamination of fish and how it might get into the food supply?
Yes, quite a lot actually. Even a couple of years ago, I would have had to say, it's a little bit unclear, and there were only maybe a couple of studies. Now there's quite a number of studies from all over the world looking at low trophic fish through to high trophic fish, from Antarctica through to the tropics. And a lot of these studies have actually gone to fish markets and collected fish that were destined for human consumption, or they've even gone to the grocery store. And essentially they are finding plastics in quite a lot of these fish. So there's a kind of an iconic study out of California. The California researchers went to markets in Indonesia. I think they looked at about a dozen fish species, maybe it was even more than that, and found plastic in about 25%. Now that study is about a decade old, give or take, so the plastic is probably even more widespread, and some of the studies have now started to look at the various persistent organic pollutants, so things like DDT and flame retardants, and also the heavy metals that are in those fish products that are often associated with plastics. And generally there's an association there. So if you have plastic, you have those chemical pollutants as well. Yeah. And that includes shellfish as well. So mussels, clams, various other filter feeders. If you're filter feeding from the ocean, not for all species, but for quite a number of species, they are finding the very, very small particles are being captured and filtered out by our filter feeders.
We've just got one question from
Online.
Our online. Actually, we've got a few, but I think you've briefed on most of them really. Just one. Could we get a rundown? What happens when you burn plastics?
It's kind of a two-pronged answer to that. So if you're burning it in something like pyrolysis, which is a very high-tech, extremely high-temperature device, which is in a way a type of like waste energy, then often they're burning it at such an exceptionally high temperature, and they have a number of filters on this high-tech equipment that a lot of the chemical compounds that we would be quite worried about are filtered out and prevented from being released out into the atmosphere. Doesn't necessarily mean everything is prevented, but often it's the majority are retained. Now, some of the waste product that comes out of these pieces of equipment, essentially as ash, that still has to be disposed of, and that tends to be extremely toxic. So there's kind of that back end issue that we have to deal with later. And as far as I know, there's not really a solution for that. So it's not a perfect kind of totally closed loop system. But unfortunately, pyrolysis is not the norm for most of the world, including the developing world, where plastic is either being burned as, sadly, as a replacement for a lot of timber and things like that. So people around the world in developing countries where they lack a lot of other resources are actually burning plastics instead of wood and other materials to even like cook their food. It is sometimes viewed as an unlimited resource. It's free, and there's endless quantities of it, so you can understand why that belief would persist. And these are often disadvantaged communities, so it makes sense. But essentially, when plastic is cooked, it's heated at low temperature like that. It releases a lot of the toxic compounds, often volatile organic compounds, which are incredibly toxic, and you can inhale that, and that can make you quite sick. And so a lot of people who cook with plastics in developing nations, or who work at tip sites, also often in developing nations, where they're burning away the plastic waste just to kind of reduce the bulk of the tip, these individuals tend to suffer from a huge range of respiratory conditions. So it's incredibly bad for individual health, and of course these chemical compounds are going straight up into our atmosphere. So that's kind of generally the two outcomes.
Should we have another? Well, I think you'll agree that we've had a life-changing hour, and we can see that science is not a cold business by any means, and good science happens because of good people. We have one of them with us here. We thank you very much, and we hope in every possible way that there's not too much plastic in this.
Thank you. Thank you, Rupert.
Now, the next meeting will be on June the 27th, and that will be our centenary meeting, 100 years since the first meeting of the restarted northern branch of the Royal Society of Tasmania. As I said, we hope to have the new governor present, but we're not sure about that yet. The lecturer will be Mr. Ralph Bottrell, and he will be speaking on what made Tasmania. We chose a geological subject because our very first lecture was on a geological subject, a little before my time. So you'll be most welcome on June the 27th, and I hope that the de-restriction will make it possible for us to have a cup of tea in the traditional manner, at least on that occasion.
We'll have our tea back then.
So thank you for your attendance on such a beautiful afternoon, and I think you'll agree it's been very worthwhile. Thank you.